Psalm 16 is where we are tonight. Psalm 16. We'll see if we can get, I know we can get through Psalm 16, but if we can get on and maybe finish 17, that'd be good, because the 18th one is a very good psalm, but it's very long. And as we said, we're going to continue this study till the end of April, and then we're going to study. We're going to start studying on 1 Samuel. So we'll just see. We get to where we get. We know this Psalm 16. It's a very, in many ways, it's a joyful, happy psalm. It talks about the goodness of God, how good God is. It talks about the hope of the faithful. The title that my Bible has given is The Hope of the Faithful and Messiah's Victory. It's a psalm about trusting in the Lord as well, as so many of the psalms deal with that issue. Bless you. And so when we look at the end of this psalm, especially say beginning verse 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, we see some of the great blessings that are found in God as being our leader, and following God and having faith and trust in God. If you'll notice under the superscriptions, you'll notice that it says a miktam of David. I think we covered this last week. I know we covered it a couple weeks ago. We don't know what a miktam is. we are victim to finding out what a miktam is. Don't know. There's several possibilities that have been thrown out through the years, but nothing is sort of like Jell-O. It's all, you can't nail it to the wall. Nothing can be really established. It could have been something with regards to information to give to the leader. Remember that Psalms, many of the Psalms were what was used for in early worship in Old Testament times and New Testament times as well, that many of the Psalms were used as the singing part. And of course, remember, singing in biblical times and singing today is a little bit different. You might say, well, no, singing. Well, no, they did more what we would really refer to as chants in biblical times. But many of the Psalms were used. And some have said that the miktam was something to do with regards to the instructions to the song leader, if you will, about how to lead this psalm. And that could be. Some have said that it has a reference to the idea of gold, and thus when it says a miktam of David, this is a golden psalm of David. And there's several other possibilities. And so really, when you get down to it, the theologians that are really, I think, smart, they say, we don't know. And I can appreciate that, because we really don't. Yeah, it's not used the word's not used. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to nail me down on exactly the chapters, I know it's very few times. Yeah. Yeah. And so, anything else? Well, we covered verses 1 and 2, but we'll cover them again kind of quickly. He begins by talking about God is my refuge. Preserve me. The idea of preserve is the idea of keep, secure, keep or secure me, O God, for in you I put my trust. And he says, if you think about what he says, keep me, O God. And the reason is because I've put my trust in you. I've chosen you as the one I trust. Now, that's interesting, because a couple of pages over, probably in your Bible, in the 20th Psalm, he'll talk about some trust horses and some trust chariots, but we'll trust the living God. And you see that theme so many times through the Psalms. So I just kind of like that time I've ever really tried to. I've preached out of book of Psalms a lot, but I've never really tried to teach class out of it. That's why I just wanted to stay in it for a little while and then kind of jump out, because so many of the themes are repetitive. But he's asking God to to really take care of him. And then he says in verse 2, "Oh, my soul, you have said to the Lord, you are my Lord." And we see the difference there between the two Lords. Notice he says, "Oh, my soul, you have said to the Lord," and notice it's all capital letters, and we've talked about that and how that some have said that's because in the Hebrew it's the YHWH, which has we put vowels to it, and we've made it say Yahweh, and that's the name of God, many believe. But notice that he also says, "You are my Lord," and the translators translate that with lowercase letters, and the reason being because it's a different word. It's the word Adonai, which means master. And so he says, "My soul, you've said to the Lord, you've said to Yahweh, you are my Lord, you are my master. My goodness is nothing apart from you." He sees God really as the supreme God or supreme good that is to be received and to be walked in. And he walks with God and he says, "My goodness is tied in with you." And so he sees, it's kind of interesting because he sees himself as being good, but he sees his goodness as found only in God. And so he says, "My goodness is nothing apart from you. As for the saints," and the question is, who are the saints? And we have no clue. I mean, there's these verses. I looked at them again today, and I don't know. And I looked at 2-3 guys, and they basically, one of them observed the Passover and didn't say anything about it, and the other two basically said, "We have no clue." And so that's probably the way we'll leave it. As for the saints who are on the earth, they are the excellent ones, in whom all or whom is all my delight. Now, it's interesting because you kind of ask, well, whose viewpoint is this? Is he speaking from the standpoint when he says they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight? Is he speaking from his viewpoint, or is he speaking from God's viewpoint when he says they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight? And that's kind of a toss-up. Probably he's talking from his viewpoint. So he says, "I've put my trust in you, God. My goodness is found in you." And you need to know, you need to remember that all the saints, they're the excellent ones. They're your delight. Their sorrows shall be multiplied who hasten after another God. Their drink offerings of blood I will not offer, nor take up their names on my lips. But there are those that he says, notice what he says, their sorrows will be multiplied, who hasten after another God. Idolatry was rampant in biblical times. It was rampant in the Old Testament. But idolatry, basically, as the psalmist saw it, only increased one's sorrows. And he says, their drink offerings of blood, I'm not going to be guilty of that. Now, exactly what he's talking about, we don't know. There is a reference you might want to look at, Isaiah 66. In Isaiah 66, verse 3, it says, "He who kills a bull is as if he slayed a man. He who sacrifices a lamb, as if he breaks a dog's neck. He who offers a grain offering, as if he offers swine blood. He who burns incense, as if he blesses an idol, just as they have chosen their own ways, and their soul delights in their abominations." Some think that this verse that is dealing with false worship, if you will, that this is what the psalmist has reference to, and it may be. But it's the idea that they had sacrifices. Idol worship has sacrifices. They had certain probably offerings, notably some sort of blood offering, a blood drink offering, if you will. And he says, look how this idolatry just it increases their sorrow. They have this, but I'm not going to do what the psalmist says. nor am I going to take up their names on my lips. And so what he's done is he said in the first couple of verses, God, I trust in you. I want you to know that you're where my goodness lies. I want you to know that you're my delight, but I also want you to know that I understand the tragedies and the travesties of idolatry, and I'm not part of it. And so then he moves on, and he says, Oh Lord, you are the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You're the portion, you're the allotment, you're my possession, you're my inheritance, and my cup. The cup was the symbol of the cup in biblical times, was used for a lot of different things. One of the things that it was used for is the idea of food or sustenance. And so if that be true, then what he's saying is, Lord, you're the one that blesses me. You're the one that takes care of me. You maintain my lot. The word maintain can also have the idea of uphold. You uphold my lot. God secures me. God, you're giving me all these blessings. And not only are you giving me all these blessings, but you're upholding me. The lines, verse 6, the lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Yes, I have a good inheritance. The lines, once again, ambiguous is what he's talking about. Do remember that you talk about, say, in some of the prophets, they talk about plumb lines, and it's talking about judgment. But also lines were often used, as one commentator said, lines were used to measure land. Now, I don't know exactly how that worked, and he didn't get into an explanation of it. But his thought was that basically what he's saying here is that God measures out my portion. God gives me what I need. Yes, I have a good inheritance. God's taking care of me. And we all are heirs of God, right? That's what Peter said in 1 Peter 2. We're heirs of God. And so the psalmist here is saying, God blesses me. God takes care of me. God gives me what I'm supposed to have. I'll bless the Lord who has given me counsel. My heart also instructs me in night session. When he lays down, notice what he says. He says, I'll bless the Lord who's given me counsel. The Lord has imparted to me his wisdom. The Lord's imparted to me what he wants me to know. But then he talks about my heart also instructs me in the night sessions. Probably what he's having reference to is the fact that when he lies down at night and it's all quiet, it's all still, and he's laying there before he goes to sleep, he's meditating upon what's being said, what's been said. He's received the counsel of God. He's meditating, and he says, my heart also instructs me. It meditates. I meditate upon what's being said. Lord willing, not this Sunday, but the next, the 28th. Yeah, that'll be the 28th of April. We're going to talk about examining ourselves in the sermon. Examining ourselves. And this could be something that the psalmist here is doing. He's examining himself at night. And he's going along and he's letting the counsel of God that he knows and that he's read and heard, he's letting that teach him even in the night session. There's a close, Eddie Clower talked about, evidently there's a close relationship that the psalmist here feels in regards to God and his relationship with God. And maybe that is part of it. He says, I've set the Lord always before me, because he's at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Now, you'll notice these next words, this verse and verses that follow, were quoted in Acts chapter 2 by Peter, the first on the day of Pentecost. Peter applies these verses to the resurrection of the Lord, which is kind of an interesting thought. When you look at them from David's standpoint, you can say, well, okay, I don't know that that's what David was looking at when he was discussing them, but most definitely Peter could take them and say, look at the promises of God, that God takes care of us. And in many ways, that's what Peter was trying to do in Acts 2. He's leading up through the story of Jesus and in the story of Jesus, but he's also trying to tell people, look at what God's done for you. And so that's where the psalmist David is leading at this point in time. He said, I've set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. He's my companion. He's at my right hand. The right hand was the important hand. He understood God as sort of his, not only his warrior and his champion, but also the one that was there with his being his guard, being the one that protected him, being the one that was there making sure that everything was all right. And so he's defining his relationship with God as being close. And he goes on to say, therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope. And so there's a joy, there's a confidence that David has because of his relationship with God. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, in the sermon, we talked about joy that the Christian has and why we have that joy, and where it comes from, and what ultimately that joy resides within us and the reasons that it resides within us. Well, it's the joy that the psalmist has. My heart rejoices. I've got this joy. As the children sing, we have joy, joy, joy down in my heart. I've got this joy that's a result of my relationship with God. And notice what he says, my flesh also will rest or dwell safely in hope. Because of his relationship with God, I have hope. I have joy. I have hope. Now, he's going to come back to joy here in a few minutes, but notice what he says. For you will not leave my soul in Sheol. Sheol is the equivalent of it as we think about it in the New Testament is Hades. We talked about when we talked about death and the afterlife here a few months ago when we were talking about death. But he says, you'll not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You'll not allow your Holy One to undergo corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. Once again, he gets this idea of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. If you think about what he looks at, he says, okay, look in verse 9. He says, well, let's go back to verse 8. You're at my right hand. You're right with me. You're my companion. You provide, a relationship provides me, verse 9, with joy. It provides me, verse 9, with hope. Verse 10, it provides me with security. I know you're not going to leave me. You're not going to leave me in Sheol, but you're not going to allow your Holy One to see corruption, eternal death. And so there is this thought that the psalmist has of an afterlife. It's interesting when we think about death and the afterlife, when you look through the Old Testament, you don't get a real good sense of it. It's not that they didn't believe it, God didn't address it in the Old Testament. He did in the New Testament. Now, not to our complete satisfaction, admittedly, because we still have so many more questions. But at the same point in time, too, there was an understanding that there is something beyond this life. And so the psalmist says, I see that. And so he has a sense of security that there is something beyond. And then verse 11, he says, you show me the path of life. In your presence is the fullness of joy. There's a sense of satisfaction that we have because of our relationship with God. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. There's continuous blessings that come from God. And so David trusts in God. He also trusts in God, if you think about it, in the present. We should back up. He trusted God, according to this psalm, in the past, in the present, and in the future. And so he gives us a good picture, if you will, of reasons to trust in God. Because as we look and summarized again those last few verses, but notice his relationship. His relationship with God, he felt was tight. He felt was good. He felt was sound. And so it reminds us that we too can have that feeling and can have that relationship with God. And not feel as if God is some foreign, distant reality, but is so far removed from us that we can't have this relationship with him. And that's what the psalmist is dealing with. And that's sort of some of the great lessons, if you will. And that is, place your hands and place your lives in the hands of God, and you'll be blessed. Anything anybody like to say or add? All right. We'll move on. Psalm 17. This is a psalm of David, a prayer of David. At the time of the writing of this, if you've read it recently, you know that you would say, I'd like to know when David was writing this in his life. I think we all would. It's evident in this psalm that David is being pursued, or David is being surrounded by an enemy. Now, you can look and you can say, well, that was when Saul was after him in 1 Samuel, and that would definitely fit. Also, take a step back and you can say, when man's king, man, when he sits on his throne, everybody's after him then. I recall one man years ago as an elder, he talked to me one time and he said, he said, before I became an elder, I had friends. I said, yeah. He said, as soon as I became an elder, I lost all my friends. And he said they all either wanted to use me or they all walked away from me. And that's kind of a sad thought. But when a man gets into a higher position, sometimes that happens. And so it could have been when David was king that he had all of these enemies after him. It's possible. So we don't know. What I'm basically trying to say is we don't know when this was written. And so we take it as what he says with regards to his enemies. And he's even going to beseech God, I guess is probably a good term. He's going to beseech God to take care of his enemies. And we'll see that. This is a lament. It's just I guess you could say a song of crying. It's strong in its affirmation of innocence, of his own innocence, but his need for God to take care of his enemies. Let's look at it. As he pleads to God for protection. He begins by saying, hear a just cause, O God. Attend to my cry. Now, there's a lot of things that are, at least to me, that jump out that are interesting in this one verse. Notice the first line. Hear a just cause, O Lord. In other words, I don't know what you've been listening to, God, but you listen to me because what I'm about to tell you is the absolute truth, and you need to stick with me. I don't think David is, and David's we believe to be the psalmist here. I don't think David is saying, now, God, you need to stick with me because I'm so great. But you need to hear all of this. You need to pay attention to all this. I think I've made reference to the fact, not at this congregation, but another congregation I worked years past, that when there was a particular individual that would get up occasionally and lead prayer. And his prayers were beautiful, and I believe his prayers were from the heart and sincere. But right at the end, he would always end his prayers, hear us, O God. I always thought, and I still think to a certain extent, that that's somewhat redundant. In other words, it's not necessary. It's not bad. I mean, it's not something he shouldn't have said. It's just that when we're praying to God, that's sort of the implied thought. We're praying to God and we're wanting him to listen, and the promise that he gives us in the Bible is that he is listening. But while, like I say, I thought somewhat redundant, but there's nothing wrong with it. But this is sort of what David is saying. Hear me, God. And so he begins to plead his case, And what David does in this psalm is he pleads his case as an innocent man, not blameless or not sinless, but blameless. There's a difference. I think we could say that even about ourselves. We're not sinless, but because of the blood of Christ, we're blameless. And so that's how David sort of addresses this. And notice that he says, the first line, he says, hear this just cause, O God. And then he says, attend to my cry. And this cry is not just a whimpering boohoo. This cry is a shrill, loud cry. You ever heard, babies, how they cry and sometimes they hit those notes and it's like, ooh, please attend to that child. Well, that's how he says, this cry is most definitely a very high-pitched cry of pain for help. Give ear to my prayer, which is not from deceitful lips. You see, he says, I'm sincere in what I'm saying, God. Let my vindication come from your presence. The idea of vindication, John Willis says in his commentary, vindication always means judgment, and I don't agree with that. Vindication is the idea that there is some judgment somewhere, but vindication is basically showing that I'm right. And so when he says, let my vindication come from your presence, he's asking God basically to render a judgment, yes, but show that I'm right. And so he says, let your eyes look on the things that are upright. You've tested my heart. This is interesting because the idea of testing here is the idea of, we can take different metals and we can take them into a shop and we can test them to see which metal they are. Yeah, proper. Was that proper grammar? Y'all correct it if it wasn't. But we're able to take a metal and we're able to say, okay, I don't know what this metal is, and we take it to a lab and we use certain chemicals and we can test it and say, okay, that's this metal. That's iron or aluminum or whatever it may be. Well, that's the same word here. You've tested my spirit. You've put me to the test. You've tested my heart. You've visited me in the night in quietness. You've tried me and have found nothing. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? He's got a great confidence. Once again, he's not saying he's sinless, but he's blameless. And there's a huge difference. And as Christians, we can say really the same. We can say, we're not sinless. Paul tells us all sinned. Paul tells us that everybody sins, and we also know that there's none righteous, no, not one, that we are sinners. But we can stand before God blameless because, as we said a while ago, because of the blood of Jesus Christ, which came about because of the grace of God. And with that, and with those very ideas, the psalmist here is saying, look, I'm standing before you as an individual that's blameless. Now, here's something to just kind of hold in your thoughts. Lord willing, oh, I did that. But in May and June, on Sunday mornings, we're going to be talking about the grace of God. Now, maybe not exactly the way you're going to think about it, but we're going to be talking about the grace of God. And one of the things you find out is that when you study the Bible, which I know you all have, you can say, I don't find too much grace in the Old Testament. Well, you don't find the word, but you do find grace. This would be a prime example. He understands the grace of God. That he's standing as an individual that's blameless. And so he says, you've tested me. You visited me in the night. You tried my heart, but you didn't find anything. And then this next line I find very intriguing. I have purposed that my mouth shall not transgress. I've purposed. I've decided. I've made a conscious decision not to sin with my mouth. Now, We know how difficult that is because we know how slippery that tongue is. And we know how Satan really works on us. And oftentimes it's our mouth that gets us in trouble. And so the psalmist says here, David says here, he said, I've made a conscious decision to watch my mouth concerning the works of men. By the word of your lips, I have kept away from the paths of the destroyer. This is interesting right here because he says, I have kept. In translating, not so much Hebrew, but in Greek, sometimes you can make something what's called emphatic. In other words, sometimes if we make something emphatic, we put an exclamation point at the end of the line. They would use, especially in the Greek, they would use sort of just a double, if you will, sort of like a I myself would be one way of translating it. And so the Hebrew, I'm told, is emphatic here. So like when he says, I have kept away from the paths of the destroyer, I myself, I have done everything possible to have kept away from the paths of the destroyer. I've stayed away the best I can from Satan. Uphold my steps in your paths, that my footsteps may not slip. He doesn't want to suffer and for his sin, nor is he claiming that he's suffering because of his sin, but he's saying, Lord, keep me. Keep my steps in your paths. Keep me straight. Keep me on the straight and narrow. You ever pray that? I do. Many mornings before I get out of bed, Lord, help me get through this day. Help me to be what you want me to be. Uphold my steps in your paths, that my footsteps may not slip. I want to be what you want me to be. And so that's the great call here of David as he asked God to hear his prayer. He says, in hearing my prayer, I want you to know that I've tried my best, and I am trying my best to be what you want me to be, to do what you want me to do. Anything anybody like to say? So then he goes on. He says, I've called upon you, for you'll hear me, O God. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? In chapter 16, or the 16th Psalm, he says, I put my trust in you because of what you can provide and what you can do. And so now he says here in the 17th Psalm, he says, I've called upon you, for I know you'll hear me. And so incline your ear to me and hear my speech. Show your marvelous loving kindness by your right hand. This is real close. This loving kindness, this word here, is real close to the Greek word for grace. It's not the same. It's more of, it's the Hebrew word kesed, and it has the idea of a covenant love. Now, covenant love is a love that is an agreement, if you will, between two. A covenant love is the idea, okay, I love you, you love me. And so we make this agreement to love each other. And so he says, show your marvelous loving kindness, your graciousness, your kindness by your right hand. So in many ways, what he's doing is appealing to God's benevolence. It's kind of interesting. If you think about what he's done, he's asked God, hear me because I am not a bad guy. And I have dedicated my life to you. I've dedicated myself to doing what you told me to do. I know that you'll hear me, and I know that you will be good to me, good from the standpoint of benevolent. And so he goes on. O you who save those who trust in you, from those who rise up against them. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Anybody's version have something different than apple of the eye? You've heard this expression, I know. The apple of the eye is the pupil. Now, I've come across two thoughts with regards to this. One that I've heard and held for a long time, and a second one that I'd never heard till today in reading and studying this. But it says, keep me as the apple of your eye, the pupil. You know, we guard our eyes, right? We protect our eyes because we know we lose our sight, it's gone, and we can't get it back. So we protect it, and we go to the eye doctors to get them to check our eyes. And when something, you know, when we get to where we can't see, either by virtue of glasses or by virtue of some sort of disease in our eyes, we protect those eyes. And so he says here, he says, keep me, guard me carefully, cautiously, completely, thoroughly. Now, let me give you the second thought that I found from somebody else that I just thought was interesting. I don't know. I think what I just gave you is the answer. But this individual said that this Hebrew word that is translated apple here has the idea of the iris, but not from the standpoint of protection, but from the standpoint of little. In other words, when I look into your eye, I can see a reflection of me, but it's very little, right? And so he says, keep me as the little one that I am. Now, I can say I lean more towards the first explanation of the Hebrew word, but I thought the second one was kind of an interesting idea. He says, hide me under the shadow of your wings. So there's the protection. Protect me. If you think about, in many ways, the first line of verse 8 is an active protection. And the second line, hide me under the shadow of your wing, is the idea of a defensive protection. So you have sort of an active, a proactive, and a reactive or defensive protection. From the wicked who oppress me, from my deadly enemies who surround me. Protect me from those that are around me, from those who would want to defeat me. I'm going to go on because I know what the ladies are doing, and we'll just we'll wrap this up quickly, but this way we can at least wrap this up. They have closed up their fat hearts. He's real nice about his enemies. They got a fat heart. With their mouths they speak proudly. They have now surrounded us in our steps. They have set their eyes crouching down to the earth. As a lion is eager to tear his prey, and like a young lion lurking in secret places. He describes his enemies, and he is not kind. Arise, O Lord. And so he asked the Lord to arise. He needs the defense of God because of what he faces. And so it's kind of interesting. Let's read this. But think about what he wants God to do to his enemies. Arise, O God, confront him, cast him down, deliver my life from the wicked with your sword. In other words, he says, and this is where we have difficulty sometimes with the psalmist. We've talked about this before, that the psalmist kind of gets down and dirty, so to speak, and wants God to do something destructive to his own creation because they have opposed, as the psalmist would say, a righteous man. With your hand from men, O Lord, from men of the world who have their portion in this life and whose belly you fill with your hidden treasures, they are satisfied with children and leave the rest of their possessions for their babies. But I'm going to be different. As for me, I'll see your face in righteousness. The idea of seeing your face is being in the presence of God. And I'll be satisfied when I wake in your likeness. And so it's kind of interesting because he wants God to arise. He wants God to actively do something to his enemies, basically take them and destroy them. They don't care about anything. Their fatness, their richness, if you will, is found in the things of this world, verse 14. But for me, it's all about being in your presence, God. For me, I'll be satisfied when I awake in your likeness. I'll be satisfied in death when I see you in the hereafter. Once again, you think about, we said a while ago, we said, it's kind of hard pressed to find the subject of grace in the Old Testament. You find it, but to find the word. But it's kind of interesting because not a lot said about death in the Old Testament, other than people dying, of course, as we all do. And there's some said, but not a lot. But notice that the psalmist here seemingly has an understanding that there's an afterlife and that he will see it and he will see God in it. There's a lot of lessons to learn in this, but I know it's time to go. Is anything anybody like to say or add? Well, let me just throw these out. When in trouble, I think we have a great lesson to learn here in this chapter. When in trouble, pray. I think a second lesson is that there's hope beyond this life. I think we see that especially in the last verse. We know that these verses teach that God will respond, that God will hear our prayers, he'll respond, he'll be benevolent in our prayers, and he'll protect us as we beseech him. And I think a great lesson to learn from this is that our enemies may appear to have the upper hand, but the righteous have God on their side. And that's a great thought to end on. That thankfully we have the one that we need on our side. Anything else? Well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our most kind and gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the many blessings of it. We thank you for the opportunity to study your word, and we ask that your richest blessings be upon our folks this evening. We have so many folks that are going through difficulties, Vaughn's family going through the heartache of loss of a loved one. We have so many individuals that are not feeling well, that have allergies, and some have COVID and some have other issues. And we ask that you be with all the different ones, that you bless them and keep them. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us, that you hold us within the hollow of your hand as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great rest of the week. Try to stay out of trouble and stay away from illness.